The Rusty Barrel Tavern had a rule that nobody wrote down because nobody needed to. Whatever walks through that door, you let it order first. Not courtesy. Survival. It was a good rule. It had kept the furniture mostly intact and the patrons mostly alive, and on most nights it was enough. Tonight was not most nights. The door opened at the wrong end of a rainstorm and Zorna walked in wearing the expression of someone who had decided something several miles ago and was only now arriving to finish it. 7 feet. Green-skinned. Braided hair. The kind of quiet that is not peaceful but waiting. She placed a coin purse on the bar without looking at the bartender. It hit the wood like a small verdict. Strongest drinker in this city, she said. I have coin. I have time. Bring them forward. The room went quiet the way rooms go quiet when everyone is thinking the same thing and nobody wants to be the one who says it. Then 43 people turned and looked at the same man. A quiet traveler. Corner seat. Cooling soup. He looked up. Read the room. Set his spoon down. All right, he said. And the bartender briefly considered a career in farming. Zorna did not ask for silence. She simply arrived, and silence followed her in like a second shadow. She stood in the doorway of the Rusty Barrel for exactly long enough to make every person in the room aware of their own size, then walked to the bar with the unhurried certainty of someone who had never once in their life needed to hurry. The floorboards announced each step. The fire, which had been doing perfectly fine on its own, seemed to reconsider its brightness. The bartender, a man who had seen most things and been unsettled by very few of them, set down the mug he was cleaning and did not pick it up again. She was 7 feet of green muscle, braided hair, and leather armor that had been repaired so many times in so many places it had essentially become a different garment with the same memories. Her tusks were slightly uneven, the left one sitting a fraction lower than the right from an old break that had healed honest rather than pretty. She wore no weapon that anyone could see, which was somehow worse than if she had. She placed a coin purse on the bar. It landed with the specific sound of a conversation ending. I am looking, she said, in the tone of someone stating a weather condition, for the strongest drinker in this city. I have coin. I have time. I do not have patience for theatrics, so whoever it is should stand up now. What followed was a silence of extraordinary quality. It was not the silence of a room caught off guard. It was the silence of a room that understood the assignment perfectly and had collectively, immediately, and without a single word of coordination decided to fail it. Soldiers who had been loud about their constitutions 5 minutes ago became absorbed in the grain of the table. 3 adventurers near the window developed sudden and apparently consuming interest in their own boots. A man who had spent the better part of an hour loudly explaining to anyone nearby how he had once won a drinking contest against a dwarf lord in the northern provinces discovered, right at that moment, that he had very little to add to the current situation. 43 people breathed very carefully and looked at the same corner. Soren Winterborn was in that corner. He had arrived 2 hours before any of this started. He had asked for a bowl of the lamb stew, a piece of bread if there was any, and to be left alone, which the Rusty Barrel had managed for an impressive stretch of time before catastrophically failing on the 3rd item. He had eaten most of the bread. The stew was cooling in the way stew cools when a man has been eating it slowly and without urgency, the way a man eats when he has nowhere to be and no one expecting him and considers this a reasonable condition rather than a sad one. He felt the weight of 43 pairs of eyes the way you feel a change in weather. Not dramatically. Just as information. He looked up from his bowl. He took in the room in the methodical way of someone reading a document he had mostly already understood. His gaze moved from the crowd to the bar to Zorna, settled there for a moment, then traveled back across the room to the 43 people who were all looking at him with the unified expression of people who had made a decision they felt very good about. He looked at his stew. He looked back at Zorna. He set his spoon down on the side of the bowl with the care of a man performing a small, private ceremony of farewell. All right, he said. Not with courage. Not with performance. With the particular exhale of a man who had been in this room before, in different buildings, in different years, and had learned somewhere along the way that the fastest path through a situation like this was directly through the center of it. Fighting the current had never once gotten him to shore any faster. It had only ever made him wet. He stood up. He was not tall. He was not broad. He was, by every visible measure, a man who had been chosen by a room full of people because he was the least threatening option, and they were not proud of themselves, but they were also not going to change their minds. Zorna looked at him the way you look at a door you were not expecting to be this small. "You," she said. "Me," Soren said. She studied him for a moment with the evaluating patience of someone doing arithmetic she already knew the answer to. "Sit down then," she said. "Let us discuss terms." Soren pulled out the chair across from her and Saturday. The bartender picked up his glass again, realized he still had nothing useful to do with it, and put it back down. The stew continued cooling. Nobody would eat it tonight. The room had chosen Soren Winterborn the way rooms choose people they don't fully understand. Quickly, unanimously, and with the vague sense that someone else should probably be handling this. What the room saw was not much. A man of average height in a traveler's coat that had been washed enough times to forget its original color. Dark hair that sat on his head without ambition. Hands wrapped around a cooling bowl of stew with the easy comfort of someone who had learned long ago that a meal was worth protecting. Nothing about him announced anything. He had the particular quality of furniture that has been in a room so long people stop registering it as a separate object and begin experiencing it as part of the wall. This was not an accident. Soren Winterborn had spent the better part of a decade perfecting the art of being present without being noticed, which is considerably more difficult than it sounds and requires a specific kind of discipline that most people never develop because they are too busy wanting to be seen. He had learned it in the brewery, where the work mattered and the worker was incidental, and he had carried it with him the way he carried everything useful, quietly, without display, in a place where it wouldn't get damaged. He was 38 years old. He had worked 11 years in his family's brewery in a river town 3 kingdoms east, where he had learned the chemistry of fermentation before he learned the names of the kings, and had considered this an entirely reasonable order of priorities. He had learned what grain did to water and what water did to grain and what both of them together did to a person over the course of an evening, not as theory but as practice, the way you learn anything that actually matters. With his hands. With repetition. With the particular attention of someone who understood that the difference between knowing a thing and understanding it was the distance between reading about fire and being warm. He had left the brewery when his father died, and the road had seemed, at the time, like the most honest available answer to a question he hadn't been able to put in 2 words yet. That had been 7 years ago. He was still on the road. He had stopped expecting the question to resolve itself and started treating the road as the answer, which was either wisdom or avoidance, and he had made a private agreement with himself not to examine it too closely. He traded in small goods. Spices, mostly. Sometimes cloth. Occasionally information, though he never called it that because people who called it that were usually trying to make themselves sound more interesting than the information warranted. He moved between towns at the pace of someone with no fixed destination and a reasonable talent for finding the next one. He slept in places like the Rusty Barrel 2 or 3 nights a week and had developed a set of preferences about them that he kept to himself because nobody had asked. He preferred corner tables. He preferred stew over bread when both were available and bread over nothing when neither was fresh. He preferred rooms that were loud enough to think inside without being loud enough to require participation. He preferred, above all things, to be the least interesting person in any given space, which was a preference the universe had spent 7 years testing with what felt like personal investment. The room had chosen him tonight not because he was strong or because he was known or because anyone had a particular reason to believe he was capable of anything beyond finishing a meal without incident. They had chosen him because he was quiet, and because quiet, in a room full of people who did not want to be chosen, looks from a distance very much like confidence. It was not confidence exactly. It was something older than confidence and less dramatic. It was the specific stillness of a man who had a great deal of information about the thing he was about to do and had decided that sharing that information in advance would only complicate matters. He sat across from Zorna now with his hands loose on the table, his weight settled, his face arranged in the expression of someone who was listening and had not yet decided what the listening meant. He looked like a man attending a meeting he hadn't called and didn't need to run. Zorna was watching him with the flat evaluating patience of someone who had done this before and knew what to look for. She was looking for nerves. She was looking for the particular brightness in the eyes that meant a person understood what they had agreed to and was already beginning to reconsider it. She found neither. What she found instead she didn't have a word for yet, but she noted it the way you note weather on the horizon, without alarm, but without dismissal either. She leaned forward. She began to speak. And the rusty barrel, which had been holding its breath since Soren stood up, finally let it out just enough to listen. Zorna did not negotiate. That was the first thing Soren noticed about her. She did not lean in with the careful posture of someone feeling out the edges of a deal. She simply stated terms the way geography states itself, as fact, as condition, as the shape of the ground you were already standing on whether you had agreed to it or not. The terms are simple, she said. We drink. Same measure, same pace, called by the bartender. First one to stop, yield, or fall belongs to the other. You outdrink me, I am yours to command for 1 year. 1 year of service, whatever you need, wherever you need it, no argument, no condition. I outdrink you. She paused here, not for effect but because she was choosing words with the precision of someone who had learned that imprecision in contracts creates problems later. You come with me. Same terms. 1 year. I have work that requires a second pair of hands and I am tired of hiring people who disappoint me before the second week. She sat back. Those are the terms, she said. They are not open for revision. Soren looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man reading a document he found thorough if inconvenient. Then he nodded once, with the economy of someone who had decided and saw no reason to perform the deciding. All right, he said. It was the second time he had said it tonight and it landed exactly the same way. Without theater. Without the tremor that usually lived in the word when people said it before doing something they were afraid of. Just all right, flat and final, the verbal equivalent of a door closing on a room you had finished with. The bartender, who had been standing close enough to hear every word and far enough away to pretend he hadn't, turned to face the room. What happened next was not chaos exactly. It was the organized enthusiasm of people who had identified an opportunity and were moving toward it with the focus they rarely applied to anything requiring actual effort or personal risk. Chairs scraped. Voices rose. Someone near the fireplace stood up on a stool for no structural reason that anyone could identify, purely to be taller than the moment, and immediately nearly fell off it, which nobody helped with because everyone was too busy talking about money. The bets came fast and they came loud and they came with the specific recklessness of people who were not the ones sitting at that table. A soldier near the door offered 3 silver on Zorna before the bartender had finished announcing the terms, which suggested he had made the decision before he fully understood what he was betting on, which is the truest form of confidence and also the most expensive. 2 merchants near the window haggled briefly over odds with the clipped efficiency of men who did this for a living and considered a drinking contest between a human and an undefeated orc warrior to be, at its heart, a straightforward market proposition. A young man in the corner who had arrived that evening with enough coin for 1 drink and his dignity intact quietly converted his dignity into a side bet and felt briefly wonderful about it. The noise built the way noise builds in rooms where the event is real and the stakes belong to someone else. It had a particular quality to it, warm and electric and faintly guilty, the sound of people enjoying something they were glad they did not have to participate in personally. This was, if you listened carefully, the Rusty Barrel's favorite register. It was a room that loved a spectacle with the wholehearted enthusiasm of a crowd that had correctly identified itself as the audience rather than the act. Soren sat through all of it with the stillness of furniture. He did not watch the room. He watched Zorna, and specifically he watched her hands, which were resting flat on the table with the relaxed weight of someone who was already comfortable with the outcome and was simply waiting for the present to catch up to it. Her hands were large, scarred across the knuckles in the pattern of someone who had used them for work rather than decoration, and they did not move. Not once. While the room reorganized itself into the shape of an audience and the bartender lined up the first mugs with the solemn ceremony of a man officiating something he had not planned to officiate tonight, Zorna's hands stayed exactly where they were. Soren noted this the way he noted most things. Without expression, without reaction, and with the full quiet attention of someone storing information he expected to need later. The bartender set the first 2 mugs down on the table. They were full to the rim and they caught the firelight, and they sat there between Soren and Zorna like a question that had already been asked and was simply waiting, with considerable patience, for both of them to begin answering it. Zorna lifted her first mug the way a flag gets raised. The whole arm involved, the movement complete and committed, the kind of gesture that is also a statement about the person making it. She drank without pause and without performance, which somehow made it more performative than if she had tried. The ale disappeared with the efficiency of something returning to where it belonged, and when she set the mug down it met the table with a sound that was not aggressive exactly but was certainly not quiet. She looked at Soren with the patient expression of someone who had just demonstrated a thing and was waiting for the demonstration to be acknowledged. Soren picked up his mug with the hand that had been resting beside it. He drank in the way that water moves through a landscape, without urgency, without announcement, following the path that required the least resistance and the most patience. He set it down with the sound of a mug being set down, which is to say no sound worth noting, and returned his hands to the table and his attention to the middle distance where he appeared to keep most of his thoughts. The room watched both of these things happen and did not know what to do with the comparison. The problem, and it was a problem that would only deepen as the night progressed, was that the room had arrived with a story already written. The story was short and it went like this: the awkward drink, the human would try, the human would fail, the evening would resolve itself in the direction everyone had expected, and the bets laid on Zorna would pay out with the satisfying predictability of a wheel that only turns one direction. It was a good story. It was a comfortable story. It was the kind of story the Rusty Barrel had told before and knew how to end. What they were watching did not fit that story, and the room was finding this genuinely upsetting. It was not that Soren looked capable. He did not look capable. He looked like a man who had been handed a mug and had decided to engage with it thoughtfully, which is not the same thing and should not have been alarming and yet somehow was. It was something in the quality of his stillness. Most people, when they are doing something in front of a crowd, make small adjustments for the crowd without realizing they are doing it. They sit slightly straighter. They move with a fraction more deliberateness. They perform the action of doing the thing as well as doing the thing itself. Soren was not doing this. He was simply drinking ale in the way he would drink ale if no one was watching, which, in a room full of people watching very closely, was the strangest thing anyone had seen all evening. Zorna finished her second mug. Soren finished his second mug. The timing was not identical, but it was close enough that the soldier near the door who had bet early and confidently shifted his weight from one foot to the other and said nothing, which was the loudest thing he had done since placing the bet. The merchants near the window exchanged a look of the kind that passes between people who process information for a living and have just received a data point that does not conform to the model. They did not revise their position yet. They were watching. The young man who had converted his dignity into a side bet was having a more immediate reaction. He had bet on the timeline, specifically that Soren would show visible signs of difficulty by the second mug, and the second mug had come and gone and Soren had shown visible signs of nothing at all, which was not what he had paid for, and he felt this personally. By the third mug the noise in the room had changed register. It had started as the noise of certainty, people celebrating an outcome they had already decided on, and it was becoming the noise of recalculation, which is louder and less comfortable and has a quality of friction in it, the sound of a previously confident position being dragged slowly across a surface it was not designed for. Zorna was not recalculating. Not yet. But she had stopped looking at the middle distance the way she had during the first two mugs and had begun, very slightly, to look at Soren. Not with concern. With the specific quality of attention you give something when you have categorized it one way and it has begun, politely but persistently, to suggest a different category. She lifted her third mug. He lifted his. They drank. The bartender lined up the fourth without being asked because the bartender had decided the most useful thing he could do tonight was keep the mugs full and stay close enough to hear everything, and he was right on both counts, though he did not yet know how right he was going to turn out to be before the night was finished. The fourth mug arrived and Soren looked at it the way a craftsman looks at material he has worked with long enough to read on sight. Not with pleasure exactly and not with calculation exactly, but with the particular recognition of someone for whom the thing in front of them has never been a mystery and has not recently become one. He noted the color, which was darker than the first three by a shade that most people in the room would not have registered because most people in the room were not looking for it. He noted the smell, which had changed in the way that the second barrel of anything changes from the first when the temperature in the cellar varies by more than 5 degrees during fermentation. He noted these things the way he noted most things, without moving his face, without moving anything, and then he picked up the mug and drank and set it down, and that was all anyone watching would have seen. Zorna finished hers and set it down hard enough to make the table say something about it. "You drink like a man who is waiting for something," she said. It was not an accusation. It was an observation offered with the directness of someone who did not see the point of wrapping observations in softer material. Soren considered this for a moment with the expression of a man checking whether a statement is accurate before deciding how to respond to it. "I'm pacing," he said. Zorna looked at him. "Pacing is for people who are not sure they can finish." "Pacing," Soren said, in the tone of someone correcting a small but consequential error in a document, "is for people who know exactly what finishing costs and would prefer to arrive at the end with something left over." The room did not hear this exchange in full because the room was busy being loud about other things, but the bartender heard it, and two people at the nearest table heard enough of it to look up from their conversation and then look at each other with the expression of people who have caught the edge of something they don't entirely understand but suspect is important. Zorna said nothing for a moment. She looked at the empty mug in front of her and then at the empty mug in front of Soren and then at Soren, who had returned his attention to the middle distance with the serenity of a man who had said what he meant and saw no reason to add to it. "You have done this before," she said. It was not quite a question. "Not this exactly," Soren said. "I grew up in a brewery. 11 years. You learn things." He said it the way you mention the weather in a city you used to live in. As background. As context that explained other things without needing to be explained itself. He did not lean into it. He did not look at her while he said it to measure the effect. He simply said it and then the fifth mug arrived and he picked it up. What happened in Zorna next was not visible to the room. The room was occupied with the surface of events, with mugs and noise and the ongoing recalibration of bets that had seemed straightforward an hour ago and were becoming progressively less so. The room did not have access to the interior of Zorna's attention, which was fine, because what was happening there was quiet and would not have looked like much from the outside anyway. What was happening was this. She was thinking about the fourth mug. Specifically, she was thinking about the 2 seconds Soren had spent looking at it before drinking it, which she had noticed without knowing she had noticed until he said the word brewery and something in her memory went back to retrieve the image and hold it up against the new information and find that they fit together in a way that rearranged something small but structural in her understanding of the evening. She told herself it was nothing. A man who knew about ale. A man who had worked somewhere wet and grain-smelling for a stretch of years before the road took him. This was not remarkable. This was not a reason to reconsider anything. She had beaten drinkers who grew up in breweries before. She had beaten people who claimed expertise in fermentation and tolerance and the science of the body processing grain, and she had beaten them thoroughly, and they had been impressed by how thoroughly, and she had moved on. She told herself this with the firm internal tone of someone delivering a memo to a part of themselves that was not fully convinced by memos. The unconvinced part noted that none of those people had looked at the fourth mug the way Soren had looked at the fourth mug. None of them had used the word pacing the way he had used it, as precision rather than excuse. None of them had mentioned 11 years as background information rather than as a credential they were hoping would intimidate her. The fifth mug went down. The sixth was already coming. Zorna lifted her eyes from the table and looked at Soren Winterborn with the full, flat, measuring attention she usually reserved for opponents she had decided to take seriously, which was a category she updated rarely and had not updated in a very long time, and she found him looking back at her with the expression of a man who had been expecting this moment and had nothing in particular to say about it now that it had arrived. There is a point in any extraordinary evening when a room stops pretending it is having a normal one, and the rusty barrel had reached that point somewhere between the fourth and fifth mug and had been accelerating away from it ever since. The bets had started clean. Zorna to win, paying modest odds, taken by the majority of the room with the comfortable confidence of people making what they considered an obvious financial decision. By the third mug the odds had shifted enough that two men near the door had revised their positions with the brisk efficiency of merchants cutting a loss before it became a story. By the fourth mug the revisions had become conversations, and the conversations had become arguments, and the arguments had achieved a complexity that no longer had much relationship to the original question of who would finish their drink last and had evolved into something closer to a philosophical disagreement about the nature of certainty itself, conducted at volume, with ale. Someone had offered a goat. This was not a metaphor. A man in a brown coat near the middle of the room had, in a moment of escalating commitment that he would spend considerable time explaining to himself later, introduced a goat into the betting structure as collateral on a revised wager, and two people had accepted this as reasonable, which said something about the state the room had reached, and none of it was reassuring. The bartender had stopped cleaning glasses 20 minutes ago. He was still holding one. It was the same glass it had been 20 minutes ago, dry and clean and entirely finished as an object requiring his attention, and he was holding it anyway because his hands had needed something to do when his brain had stopped issuing instructions about anything except watching. He was standing behind the bar at the angle that gave him the clearest view of the table, and he had not moved from that angle, and the glass had not moved from his hand, and both of these facts would have been embarrassing to him if he had been paying attention to himself, which he was not, because he was paying attention to Soren Winterborn, specifically to the way Soren's hand moved when he reached for a mug, which was the same way it had moved every single time, the same economy, the same unhurried placement, unchanged from the first mug to the sixth in a manner the bartender found both impressive and faintly unsettling in the way that very consistent things can be unsettling when consistency itself becomes the remarkable quality. The woman near the back wall had been there since before Zorna arrived. She had come in alone, ordered one drink, and taken a seat with her back to the stone in the particular position of someone who preferred to see the room without being seen by it. She was perhaps 40, with the composed expression of a person who had learned patience as a professional skill rather than a personal virtue, and she had said almost nothing all evening, which was why almost nobody had noticed that she had won every single bet she had placed since the second mug. She had not placed large bets. That was the thing. She had placed small, precise bets, each one targeting a specific moment rather than the overall outcome, and each one had resolved in her favor with a regularity that should have attracted more attention than it had. She had bet that Soren would finish the third mug within 5 seconds of Zorna. She had bet that the room's noise would peak and then drop before the fifth mug was poured. She had bet, with very specific odds negotiated quietly with the man beside her who was still trying to understand how he had agreed to the terms, that the bartender would stop cleaning glasses before the sixth mug arrived. She was currently doing an excellent impression of a woman who had no particular investment in the evening and was simply present in the way that people are present in taverns, occupying a chair and a drink and minding a private category of business. The impression was good. It was not good enough to fool anyone who was looking directly at her, but nobody was looking directly at her because everyone was looking at the table, which was precisely the condition under which her impression worked best and which she had correctly anticipated. The sixth mug went down. Both of them. The sound of two mugs meeting the table within the same breath of each other produced a silence in the immediate vicinity of the contest that radiated outward through the room like a stone dropped in still water, quieting each ring of people as it reached them until the rusty barrel was, for the span of about 4 seconds, almost entirely without noise. Then the goat man said something about adjusting his position and the room came back to life and the bartender finally looked down at the glass in his hand and set it on the bar with the expression of someone returning from somewhere they couldn't fully account for. Soren raised his hand. Not urgently. Not dramatically. The way you raise your hand when you would like something and see no reason to make an event of the wanting. The bartender looked at him. Looked at the table. Looked at Zorna, who had gone very still in the way that still things go still when they are paying the kind of attention that has no room left in it for movement. The bartender set down the glass he had been holding for 20 minutes, picked up a clean one, and began to pour. The bartender poured the seventh mug with the careful attention of a man who understood, without being able to say exactly when he had understood it, that what he was doing had become ceremonial. The ale went in the same as it always went in, same barrel, same tap, same tired wooden counter that had absorbed more spilled drinks than it had ever been designed to, and yet the pouring felt different in the way that ordinary actions feel different when the moment around them has changed their weight. He was not a sentimental man. He had been bartending in the Rusty Barrel for 11 years, which is the kind of employment that removes sentiment the way weather removes paint, gradually and then completely. But his hands were steady in the way hands are steady when a person is paying very close attention to them, and he carried the mug to the table with the deliberateness of someone who wanted to get this particular thing exactly right. He set it in front of Soren. He stood there for a moment, which was not something he did. He was a man who moved with purpose between locations in his own establishment, and standing still behind the bar or beside a table without a clear task was not part of his usual inventory of behaviors. But he stood there, and he leaned forward slightly, and he said something to Soren in a voice low enough that the nearest table, which was close and occupied by people who had been trying to hear everything all evening, caught nothing but the shape of words without their content. What he said was this. He said that in 30 years of standing behind that bar he had seen two people drink the way Soren drank, and one of them had owned a brewery and the other one had been his mother, and he did not know what that meant exactly, but it seemed like the kind of thing worth saying out loud before the night was over. Soren looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man receiving information he found both accurate and faintly inconvenient. Then he nodded. Once, with the finality of a door finding its frame, and picked up the mug. The room was quiet in a way it had not been quiet before. The earlier silences had been the silence of surprise, of recalibration, of a crowd catching up to something it had not expected. This silence was different. This was the silence of a room that had caught up and was now ahead of itself, that understood what it was watching before the watching was finished, and was holding very still so as not to disturb the ending before it arrived. Nobody had told the room to be quiet. The quiet had simply assembled itself out of the collective instinct of 43 people who had spent the evening revising their understanding of the night and had arrived, all at roughly the same moment, at a version they did not want to interrupt. The goat man was not moving. The merchants were not talking. The soldier near the door who had bet early and confidently and had spent the last hour quietly coming to terms with the consequences of that confidence was standing with his arms at his sides and his drink forgotten in his hand, watching Soren Winterborn hold a seventh mug with the same unhurried ease with which he had held the first one, and feeling something he would not have a word for until much later, which was the specific feeling of watching someone be exactly and entirely themselves in a moment that was asking them to be something else. The coin fell from somewhere in the back of the room. It made the small clear sound that coins make on stone floors, a sound that under normal circumstances would have been swallowed entirely by the noise of an evening in the Rusty Barrel and would have registered with no one. In the silence that had settled over the room it was audible to everyone, and 6 people turned to look at it with the instinctive attention of people responding to the only sound in a quiet space. The coin rolled a short distance and came to rest against the leg of a chair and stayed there. Nobody moved toward it. Nobody reached down. It sat on the floor in the orange-edged light of the fire and nobody touched it, and somehow this was correct. Somehow leaving it there was the only appropriate response to a coin that had chosen this particular moment to announce itself, and the room accepted this without discussion. Soren drank. He drank the 7th mug the same way he had drunk the first 6, with the same pace, the same quiet, the same complete absence of theatre, and he set it down and his hands returned to the table and he looked at nothing in particular and breathed in the unhurried way of a man whose body had not been asked anything it did not already know how to answer. Zorna had not moved. She had been still since the bartender began pouring, and she was still now, her hands flat on the table, her eyes on Soren, her face arranged in an expression that had no performance left in it. Whatever she had come in wearing tonight, the confidence and the history and the 17 contests arranged behind her like a wall she had built one victory at a time, she was not wearing it in the same way anymore. It was still there. But it fit differently. The way clothing fits differently on a body that has changed while the clothing stayed the same. She said 4 words. Quietly, to herself, in the specific register of a private thought that had become too large to stay entirely internal. Her lips moved and the words came out just above silence, and the bartender, who was still standing close because he had not yet found a reason to move away, heard them with the clarity of someone standing in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, which is to say by complete accident, and also by the inevitable logic of a man who had spent 30 years learning where to stand in his own room. He would not repeat them that night. He would not repeat them the next morning when the story began its rapid and embellished circulation through the city, or the week after when a traveler came through asking about the contest and offered him coin for details. He would keep them the way you keep the specific weight of a moment that you understand, even as it is happening, belongs to itself and not to the people who will later ask you to describe it. He would keep them for years, turning them over occasionally in the privacy of his own memory, the way you turn over a coin whose value you cannot identify but whose quality you recognize, and he would tell them once, eventually, to a writer who came through on a cold evening and asked the right question in the right way and offered, in exchange, something the bartender valued more than money. The seventh mug sat empty on the table. Zorna looked at it. Then she looked at Soren. And in the looking there was something new, something that had not been in her face when she walked through the door, or when she set the coin purse on the bar, or when she stated her terms with the flat confidence of a woman reciting facts. It was not defeat exactly, and it was not surrender, and it was not the expression of someone who had lost a thing they needed. It was something quieter and more permanent than any of those. It was the expression of a person standing at the exact moment when a story they have been living inside for a very long time reveals, gently and without apology, that it has an ending after all. She reached for her own mug. Her hand was steady. It had always been steady, and it was steady now, and it would be steady when she picked it up and drank and set it down, but the bartender noticed, because the bartender noticed everything tonight, that she was a half-second slower than she had been on the sixth. And that half-second was not exhaustion, and it was not weakness, and it was the most honest thing he had seen in 30 years of standing behind a bar watching people reveal themselves one drink at a time. Zorna had won her first drinking contest at 19 in a garrison town at the edge of the Stoneback Mountains, against a man twice her age who had held the local record for 6 years and considered himself, with some justification, unbeatable. She had not gone in looking for a contest. She had gone in looking for a meal and a dry place to sleep, and the contest had presented itself the way contests always presented themselves to her, which was to say that it had presented itself to someone else first and then been redirected toward her by a room full of people who had looked at a young orc sitting alone at a corner table and made a set of assumptions that she had spent the next 17 contests systematically dismantling. She had won that first one without strategy. She had won it the way young people win things, on constitution and stubbornness and the specific invincibility of someone who does not yet know enough about losing to be afraid of it. She had not known, sitting across from that red-faced garrison man with the room cheering for him and tolerating her, that she was beginning something. That the night would become a reference point. That she would carry it forward into the next contest and the one after that, each victory adding itself to the structure the way stones add themselves to a wall, one at a time, until the wall is the thing you live inside rather than a thing you built. 17 contests. For kingdoms. The record had followed her the way records follow people who keep moving, which is to say it had preceded her, arriving in each new town before she did, carried by travelers and merchants and the particular enthusiasm of people who enjoy telling stories about things they did not personally witness. She had walked into rooms where people already knew her name and already knew the number, and she had seen in their faces the thing that the record did to her before she had said a single word, which was that it made her a conclusion before she was a person, an ending before she was a beginning, a story that had already been told and was only now being confirmed. She had not minded this. She had told herself she had not minded this. She had told herself that the record was simply accurate, that 17 was just a number that happened to be true, that the way people looked at her when they heard it was nothing more than the appropriate response to a verifiable fact. She had built this argument carefully over a number of years and had lived inside it with the same comfort with which she lived inside the record itself, and she had not examined either of them too closely because there are structures you do not examine closely when they are the structures you are standing on. She was examining them now. She picked up the 8th mug, which the bartender had placed in front of her with the quiet efficiency of a man who had decided the most useful thing he could do was keep the mugs coming and let the evening resolve itself, and she drank with the same steadiness she had brought to every mug before it, because her body did not know how to be unsteady, and she was not going to teach it tonight in front of 43 people who were watching her with the held-breath attention of an audience that had stopped being certain about the ending. Her hands were steady. Her posture was steady. Everything visible about her was exactly as it had always been, and the room could not see what was happening underneath it, which was fine, which was how she preferred it, which was the only way she had ever known how to carry anything difficult. What was happening underneath it was not collapse. She wanted to be precise about this, even internally, even in the privacy of her own recalculation. She was not falling apart. She had never fallen apart in her life, and she was not going to begin in the Rusty Barrel over a drinking contest with a quiet man who knew about barley. That was not what this was. What this was the specific sensation of a weight she had not known she was carrying beginning to shift. Not dropping. Not disappearing. Just moving, redistributing itself across a different set of surfaces, and in the moving, revealing its actual size for the first time. Because you cannot know the true weight of something you carry constantly. You can only know it when it moves. The record was heavy. She understood this now in a way she had not understood it before tonight, not because she was losing it, but because for the first time in 17 contests she was in the presence of someone who was not impressed by it. Not dismissive of it, not hostile to it, not performing indifference as a strategy. Simply and genuinely unbothered by it, the way a craftsman is unbothered by another craftsman's reputation because they are too occupied with the work itself to spend attention on the surrounding mythology. Soren had not mentioned the record once. He had not looked at her with the particular combination of intimidation and determination that she had seen in every previous opponent, the look that told her they were fighting the number as much as they were fighting her. He had looked at her the way you look at a problem you find genuinely interesting, and he had applied himself to the evening with the focused quiet of a man who was here for the thing itself and not for what the thing meant, and this had done something to the record that 17 victories and 4 kingdoms and years of accumulated mythology had never managed to do. It had made her see it from the outside. And from the outside it looked different than it did from within. From the outside it looked like a very tall wall that she had built around a very small question, which was simply whether she was good enough, which was the question she had been answering for 17 contests without ever quite arriving at an answer that felt finished, because the answer to that question is not a number and cannot be made into one no matter how many times you try. She set the 8th mug down. Across the table, Soren set his down within the same breath. His face was the same face it had been all evening, composed and unhurried and entirely present in the way of someone who is doing a thing they understand and finds the understanding sufficient company. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the room around them leaned forward with the collective instinct of 43 people who could feel without being able to articulate it that the contest was no longer only about drinking, and had not been for some time, and that whatever was happening at that table in the firelight of the Rusty Barrel was approaching something that endings are made of. The bartender lined up the 9th mug without being asked. His hand, for the first time all evening, was not entirely steady. He noticed this and said nothing about it and kept pouring, because some things you simply pour through, and this was one of them. The 9th mug went down the same way the first one had, which was the point, which had always been the point, though most of the room was only now understanding this fully enough to feel it rather than just observe it. There was no announcement. No declaration, no dramatic moment where one of them placed their hands flat on the table and said the words that ended things. The contest simply arrived at its conclusion the way long journeys arrive at their destinations, not with ceremony but with the sudden specific recognition that you are no longer moving toward something because you are already there. Zorna set her 9th mug down and her hand stayed on it, not gripping, just resting, and she looked at the empty bottom of it for a moment with the expression of a person reading the last line of something they had believed, until very recently, did not have a last line. Then she laughed. It came out of her the way weather comes, without preamble, without the social architecture that usually surrounds laughter in public, the setup and the permission and the slight performance of finding a thing funny. This was not that kind of laugh. This was the kind that originates somewhere deeper than the decision to laugh and arrives in the room already fully formed, unguarded and genuine and slightly surprised by itself. It was loud, because Zorna was constitutionally incapable of producing quiet laughter, but it was not the loud laugh of someone performing enjoyment for an audience. It was the laugh of a person who had not been genuinely surprised in a very long time and had, without fully realizing it, stopped expecting to be, and was now experiencing the particular delight of an expectation being wrong in the best possible direction. The room did not know what to do with this for approximately 3 seconds. Then it laughed too, not because everyone understood why, but because genuine laughter in a room full of people is one of the few things that does not require explanation to be contagious. The tension that had been building in the rusty barrel since the 7th mug came out of the room all at once like air from a room that has finally had a window opened in it, and what replaced it was warm and unstructured and slightly giddy in the way of people who have been holding themselves carefully for too long and have just been given permission to stop. Soren looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved in the way it had been threatening to move all evening without following through, and he picked up the 9th mug, which still had ale in it, and held it toward her with the economy of a man making a toast that did not require words because the words were already understood by both parties. Zorna picked up her mug. There was still enough left. They drank together, not racing, not performing, just two people finishing a thing they had started, and the simplicity of it was its own kind of statement. Soren set the mug down, pushed back his chair, and stood up with the unhurried movements of a man whose body had done a significant amount of work this evening and was prepared to be reasonable about it. He said good night to Zorna, who nodded at him with the specific nod of someone filing a person carefully into a category that did not previously have enough occupants. He said good night to the bartender, who said good night back and meant considerably more by it than the word contained. And then Soren Winterborn walked across the rusty barrel, up the stairs, and went to bed, leaving behind him a room full of people with a great deal to say and no one to say it to who had actually been sitting at the table. The legend began before he reached the top of the stairs. It began the way all legends begin, with someone saying what happened and someone else saying what they had seen, and the two accounts being close enough to combine and different enough to improve, and the improvement being accepted because the improvement was better and because nobody in the rusty barrel that night was going to let strict accuracy stand between them and a good story. By the time the room had finished its next round, the 9th mug had become the 10th. By the following morning, in the retelling that crossed 3 separate breakfast tables, it was 11. By the end of the week, in the version traveling east by merchant cart, it was 13 and Soren had been notably taller and Zorna had reportedly wept, which was so far from the truth that Zorna herself, when she heard it several months later in a different city, laughed again, which was becoming, quietly and without her full cooperation, a thing she did more often than she used to. The coin stayed on the floor that night. Nobody touched it, nobody claimed it, and in the morning the bartender found it beside the chair leg where it had come to rest and picked it up and held it in his palm and looked at it for a long moment in the thin early light coming through the shutters. It was an ordinary coin. It had no distinguishing marks, no particular age, no reason to be kept over any other coin that had ever passed through his hands in 30 years of tending bar. He put it on the shelf behind the bar, against the wall, in the small space between two bottles where it fit exactly as though the space had always been waiting for it. He did not price it. He did not explain it to the staff or to the regulars who eventually noticed it and asked. He simply left it there, in the place it had found, and tended his bar around it, and on the nights when the rusty barrel was loud and full and someone at a corner table was minding their own business with a bowl of something warm, he would sometimes look at the coin and remember the silence it had fallen into, and find that the memory was still exactly the right size, unchanged and unexaggerated, the one true thing in a story that had grown in every other direction. It was not for sale. It had never been for sale. Some things you keep not because of what they are worth but because of what they mark, which is the place where an ordinary evening became something else entirely, and you happened to be standing close enough to hear it happen, and you were paying attention, and you did not look away. You just watched an undefeated legend walk into a room already being the ending of her own story, and leave it having to write a new one from the beginning. She did not fall apart. She did not rage. She laughed first. The proudest person in that room, the one who had built 17 victories into a wall she had been living inside for a decade, heard one quiet man order one more mug and felt the whole structure shift in a way that 4 kingdoms and years of mythology never managed. Here is your question, and we will be reading every answer because this one is worth asking. What is the story you have been telling about yourself for so long that you forgot it was a story and started believing it was a fact? Drop your answer in the comments. We will be there reading. Tell us where in the world you are watching from tonight. If this story found something in you that needed finding, the subscribe button is right there, and this one earned the like. We will see you in the next one.